Hi, this is Paul. On yesterday's live stream, Brian Sartor mentioned a podcast, The Dispatch, with Jonah Goldberg and Molly Worthen. Now, Molly Worthen got a bit of press not too long ago because she's become a Christian and she's become an evangelical Christian. But I didn't know her personally, but her book, Apostles of Reason, was I thought, a really wonderful book, a really helpful book on the history of the neo-evangelicals. And she's just now written another book called Spellbound about charism or charisma. And I bought the book already, and I've already started digging into it. It's gonna sort of have some opponent processing with my current obsession with Pope Pius IX. So we'll see who wins. But this was a great interview. I can't play the whole thing. I'm in church on a Saturday because the Nigerians are coming in to do a thing in the sanctuary, and my wife's busy with a thing that she needs to do. So let's go.
Ask when I'm on a book tour, which is simply, what's your book about?
My book is about how we make sense of the current political moment in the context of the longue durée of American history. And it's about where the abiding human impulse to connect our puny mortal suffering and chaos to a big transcendent narrative goes as a culture secularizes and people are less frequently going to traditional houses of worship. And it's about how perhaps there's not as hard and fast a line between religion and political spheres as we sometimes think.
So when she said that, it was like, oh yeah, I am so down for this conversation. I'm currently in The Prisoner of the Vatican, which was was one of Kurtzer's earlier books. I think he published it in 2004. And I think actually this book led to this whole series of books that he's done on the papacy. And again, I made some disclaimers about him in this series. I mean, it's definitely told from a particular secular modernist point of view, but there's still a ton of super interesting information. For example, I just finished chapter 6 this morning, where it talks about Victor Emmanuel II. Now, when I visited Rome a couple years ago, one of the things, so I'm in the Forum, I'm here, I'm there, I'm all over. One of the things that you can see if almost anywhere that I went in Rome were these huge statues that are way up on top of this monument. And I thought, this must be some monument. Well, it's a monument to Victor Emmanuel II, which is really fascinating because it's this enormous monument right on, I believe it's on Capitoline Hill. It's right next to the Forum. And this guy, this monument is too big to tear down. I think they had some reconstruction going on. Now what's interesting is that Victor Emmanuel, and this you'll find often, it was true of Mussolini, it was true of Victor Emmanuel. Victor Emmanuel had little interest in religion and even less regard for priests. The amount of hatred, see, this is what's so difficult, because you can say the amount of hatred for the priests in Rome and in the Papal States, at least, seems palpable, but that's not. It's sort of like you want to talk about the hatred in America for Donald Trump. Is there a lot of hatred in America for Donald Trump? Yeah. But this kind of hatred is sort of, it gets into very much Girardian categories, because you almost get the sense that for certain kind of people, especially in the media, if Donald Trump went away, they would mourn his passing just because he makes them so much money, he gets them so much attention, and he is just such a cash cow. And so this whole period after, the chapter ends in a really nice place, because it's not just one side or two sides. You had Victor Emmanuel, who loved being king, but didn't really have time to govern, and so found governing annoying, and his ministers would make him do stuff that he sort of had to do, but didn't want to do. And then you've got this other aspect, like Mazzini and the other anti-papal Italian nationalists. On the other hand, Rome was the spiritual center of another vision of the country, and so it's not just sort of two visions. You've just got all of these other visions. But again, I think part of the reason that polarization is so common with human beings is that because consciousness and attention and awareness is so monofocal, we can manage opposites fairly easily, for and against. But once you get to three or four, most people just sort of check out. Many of Rome's new rulers had mixed feelings. So then Rome is going to be the capital of Italy. And this was a hugely debated thing internationally because it had so many ramifications because of these countries that in the 19th century are just wrestling with these questions of religion and politics and society and how does it all fit together. Many of Rome's new rulers, unification meant the rise of a third great Rome after the ancient empire that had once ruled much of the world, and then the Rome of the popes, and the city again, the center of worldwide importance. Even beyond this feeling, given the papacy's claims as the rightful ruler of Rome, the failure to make Rome Italy's capital risks ceding the Holy City to the Pope, making it a foreign center at the heart of a new Italian capital state. When, as part of an earlier agreement with the French, the capital of Italy, and again, now the whole concept of Italy is a very new concept, even though we now use that language about, and imagine that Italy is ancient. Victor Emmanuel, the king of Italy, didn't even like speaking Italian. Most Italians didn't speak Italian. They spoke their regional dialects. And in that way, too, it's sort of similar to Germany and German unification. Yet many of Rome's new rulers had mixed feelings about the city, which few of them knew well. Cavour, the architect of Italian unity, had never set foot in Rome. His new governor, La Morma, regarded the city as a political and cultural backwater overrun by priests. Moving the seat of government to Rome, he argued, is an error that may cost Italy dearly, for Rome is not suitable either morally or materially. Like other nationalist conservatives, La Mora's reservations were mixed with fear at the prospect of an Italian king sharing the same city with the Pope. La Mora proposed what came to be known as the Russian solution, with Rome, like Moscow, as the holy city and Florence, like St. Petersburg, as the seat of government. His proposal did not get far. The anomaly of having a king and a pope in the same city claimed by each as his capital was keenly felt in other European capitals as well. 2 days after the Italian troops pushed through the Porta Pia and into Rome, the British ambassador to Italy advised London of the difficulty of making a constitutional and excommunicated king by the side of an infallible pope, of a representative parliament by the side of an absolute authority, a liberty of the press, and the freedom of discussion by the side of the Inquisition. He concluded that it would produce a state of things which can hardly be expected to work harmoniously. Foreign ministers throughout Europe likewise voiced misgivings about Italy's rush to move its capital. The conservatives in Italian government were of two minds. To move the capital to Rome risked inflaming the conflict with the Pope. Not to move it risked energizing the left-wing forces or perhaps even threatening the monarchy. What was most remarkable in the moment, reported Italy's foreign minister, was the depth of popular antipathy in Rome against the government of the priests. The Romans feared that the king's government, which they viewed as a foreign body of Piedmontese, was planning to work out a deal with the Pope at their expense. They wanted the capital to be moved immediately, and the monasteries and the convents that dominated the city abolished at once. This is the Romans, the people who sort of worked for this whole machinery. It would almost be as if the state workers of Sacramento wanted, to make sure that the United States didn't get involved, but they also didn't have much love for the governor, which is frankly Not unbelievable and not uncommon, because state workers have their own issues that they're dealing with. What was the government to do? Asked Visconti in late October. Because one of the things was the king didn't want to live there either. He couldn't stand Rome. And what's more, they were going to move him into the palace that the Pope had lived in for centuries. The Pope at this point had withdrawn to the Vatican, leaving the Quirinal Palace sort of unoccupied. And so, well, let's move the king into the Quirinal Palace. And the king was like, I don't want to live there. And so neither of them wanted to live there. The Pope, however, was just so then there was so then they want the keys to the Quirinal Palace. Despite Lamor's objections, Lamormora's objection, the government decided to move and order him to take possession of the Quirinal Palace. When first asked to hand over the keys to the building, Pius is said to have responded, "Who do these thieves think they are kidding, asking for the keys to open the door? Let them knock it down if they, like Bonaparte soldiers, when they wanted to seize Pius VII, came through the window. But even they did not have the effrontery to ask for the keys." Rebuffed by the Pope, La Marmora found a locksmith who on November 8 used a picklock to force open the massive front gates. In his account of the incident, Pius IX's biographer, Bishop Palskar, noted, not without a certain satisfaction, that the locksmith was struck dead shortly thereafter. As the Pope saw it, such signs of God's wrath were everywhere, although none was more powerful than the flood that devastated Rome as the new year approached. The Romans were used to periodic flooding, so when the fall proved to be exceptionally rainy, they looked at the Tiber's rising waters with some concern. By Christmas, water levels were 7 meters above normal, and soon the land along the rivers were underwater. The newly liberated Jewish ghetto, first among them, mail service from northern Italy was suspended as the Tiber's waters kept flooding. However, the king also liked this because he didn't then have to go there, and he was happy. And then he writes the Pope a nice letter that the Pope never writes back. In fact, although the king and the Pope would subsequently live a mile apart, the Pope never met him. And towards the end of the chapter, it's the king basically says to the Queen of Holland, "I would really love to see the Pope leave Rome, because I can't look out the window at the Quirinal without seeing the Vatican, and it seems to me that Pius IX and I are both prisoners." So these issues continue, but what I love about her approach, she's going to get into this question of charisma.
All right, so we should, since it's sort of at the center of your argument, we should probably take a minute and do the terminology here. Charisma. I know charisma because I've read a good deal of Weber, and I know it means more than just being charming. But you go back to the original.
Now, what's interesting is someone has clearly set her up with. They have teleprompters that you can put up with your camera, and so you're always looking directly. Justin Wells does this. I always find it a little creepy because they're just staring at me the whole time. I mean, you can even tell, like right now, I can look at the little screen that's above the camera, and then down below is the lens. If I look into the lens the whole time, you get creeped out.
Meaning of the word. So what is charisma? Why is it more than just being charming?
Yes. Well, the book is about charisma in both the original theological sense of the term, as well as the sense in which we use it in more colloquial speech when we're talking about a compelling leader in religion or politics or some other sphere. And I think the two have always been intertwined, the two senses of charisma. It comes from the ancient Greek word charis, meaning divine anointing, chosenness by the gods, which in that ancient context meant, receiving gifts, blessings that could redound to your benefit or backfire on you. And then in the New Testament, St. Paul takes that ancient idea and he turns it into charisma, which means a range of things in different contexts. Sometimes he uses the word to mean the free gift of salvation that God gives to all believing Christians. In other cases, he uses it to describe specific spiritual gifts, supernatural, crazy stuff, prophecy, the gift of healing, speaking in tongues, this kind of thing. And the term stayed kind of cordoned off in the world of Bible nerds and, theology classes for 1900 years until, as you alluded to, the German sociologist Max Weber borrowed the term in the first decade of the 20th century. And I think he tried to kind of broaden it and reinvent it in a way that would make his colleagues in the new emerging disciplines of the secular social sciences less squeamish about using a term that was still kind of fundamentally theological. So he sort of broadens it to describe a kind of authority that is distinct from authority that comes from a leader's role in an institution or via tradition or through having military might, but is rather a relationship between leaders and followers premised on the follower's conviction that the leader has a set of supernatural gifts or achievements. So, he doesn't really untether it entirely from that religious context. And from there, I think it has found its way into our popular speech and ended up in kind of a muddle. I mean, part of why I took on this project is because I just wanted an occasion to get clear in my own mind what this thing is. I think charisma is often a term that we punt to when we are observing a dynamic between a leader and followers, and we really don't get it. We don't see what people are getting out of this person, and there's not like an obvious sort of quid pro quo happening. It's mystifying, and so we punt to this term. When I began the project, I definitely confused it with charm. I thought I would be writing about a lot of very charming people who had high emotional intelligence or really good at working the room. They'd probably all be really good looking and amazing public speakers. But what I found was that was true more in the breach than in the pattern of things. And the broader pattern was that charismatic figures are deeply polarizing. They tend to have people who find them incredibly compelling, and then just as many, probably more people who find them totally repulsive. And they don't evoke a lot of lukewarm reaction. And the heart of that, where I landed after sort of surveying 400 years or so of history, is that the heart of charisma is a particular kind of storytelling. It's a relationship premised on a leader's invitation to followers to come take on a set of roles in a big, grand narrative that make better sense of the followers' individual lives and struggles than the other stories on offer in the culture. And
I think that's a great way of framing it, where I think it's a great way of framing it.
The charisma, while the storyteller is important, the locus of the charisma is really in the story itself, which helped me make sense of how charisma could travel, how people could join religious movements without ever necessarily personally encountering the leader. And then it becomes this really interesting way of tracking what I think are abiding human hungers and anxieties across time. Because as we move through American history, we see certain types of charismatic stories rise and fall in their cultural resonance. And I think that gives us a way to understand the dominant anxieties and desires of each era of American history.
So there's a lot in there, and we're going to get to America in a short while. But first of all, it's funny. There are a lot of words. The one that comes to mind for me that's very similar to charisma is genius. Genius originally was this idea that a spirit came and visited you and imbued you, was a muse that came and gave you this moment of clarity and creativity. And, and that was the way it was. Not until pretty much the post-Enlightenment period that,
when I think about I try to get my mind around what happened in terms of our imagination. Part of what I think happened is sort of a substance imaginary took over a much more functional imaginary, because when we talk about these spirits, they're deeply functional, that they're deeply functional things. I think about Jonathan Peugeot's answer at Midwestuary about whether or not estuary or the TLC is a thing.
Here, but this one is submitted to us from Matthew P. This is it. What is the spirit we are participating in a fellowship around? What is the spirit we are participating in a fellowship around?
Around what spirit are we fellowshipping?
Yeah, around what spirit are we fellowshipping?
I didn't have time to stop.
I think they mean here in this conference. That's my assumption.
I believe so.
And I don't remember who was talking about it, but I think it was in John's talk. Can we put language? There are many different reasons why people came. We know that. So there's a purpose question. And I think I can make hours of video on this, and
you will.
There's a lot of different reasons people came here, but I do. Part of the reason, so I am in a estuary group, and as much as I can, I'm going to be there. And then I also ask what the other estuary groups are doing and talking about. And there are definitely patterns that are emerging. And again, Dan Wagonmaker, who's part of the putting this thing together, said, most of the people have come here have had some deconstruction in their life, and they are reconstructing. And I think all of us on stage, including Kale, that's true of us. The meaning crisis has affected us at one level or another, and we are in some process of putting lives back together and communities back together. And so when I listen to most of you out here, you have sensed that in this project, there is a degree of promise, maybe for yourself, maybe for your family, maybe for your church, maybe for your neighborhood, that when I leave here, I will leave here with something. It will be hard to articulate what, but it won't just be that I'm a Vervaeke fanboy, or I'm a Peugeot fanboy, or boy, I got to see Rod Dreher and Elizabeth. I read all her stuff. It's not just that. I think people have a sense that whatever it is we are doing together is worthwhile and it's helping. Exactly how? Not sure, can point to things, but to me, that's what I see. And if you can.
So, I mean, if you want to know what, let's say, type of spirit you're under, the first thing you do is you look at the name of the thing that you're participating in. So, 2 names. This little corner of the internet, and then second name, estuary. So, clearly, those two names are referring to the fact that this is not a central community. This is not a church. You don't form a complete body like a family or like a company or a team. You know, it is a marginal in-between place where, as Paul said, you're relearning the skills, reconnecting with people in order to go back to your actual real life communities and be able to participate in them more fully or more entrenched. And so I think that's the best way to understand what it is, because you wouldn't have names like that if it was more. And it's not, this is neither a criticism or a celebration. It's just, you can recognize what something is. And in some ways it's great, because if it was more than that, maybe it'd be a cult, right? Right? Exactly. And if it was like less than that, then maybe it would just be kind of an information conference. And it's neither of those extremes. It's something in between. And so I think it's the best way to recognize the spirit you're under, is to look at what's actually there. So.
I like to tell the story often of this woman. She's a real personal hero of mine, Kamila Bendova. She's quite old now. She was one of the leaders of the Czech resistance, the dissident movement against communism. Her husband went to prison for 4 years for it, but she was kind of the den mother. They met at the Benda family apartment. Václav Havel was there. All the top leaders were there. And I remember asking her when I interviewed her for Live Out My Lives, I said, you and your late husband were Catholics, but all the people in the movement, in this fellowship of the ring that you had in your apartment, they were all atheists, hippies, none of them were Christians. I said, was that difficult for you and your husband? Because they were very conservative Catholics. She said, no, it wasn't at all, because we knew when we were standing up to communism, to totalitarianism, that the most important quality one needed was courage. She said, Rod, you mustn't think that our fellow Catholics had that courage. Almost all of them kept their heads down. They didn't want trouble. My husband and I felt, as Christians and just as human beings, we couldn't do that. We had to stand up. And if we were going to stand up, we needed a community to stand with. And we found it in Havel and all these hippies and atheists. And she went on to explain that. And we knew that if we got taken to jail, they would look after our kids and would raise them to understand the world they were in. And they knew they could trust us too. And I found that really interesting. And I think I tell the story now because I think it might apply to what's going on here. This is my first time at any estuary event. And I've noticed that these rooms are full of people who don't all have the same religious faith or any religious faith at all. Maybe not the same political convictions. But what seems to unite folks is asking the same kinds of questions. And you can look to somebody who may not share your faith or anything else, but you can say, you too, you've seen this too. And I'd much rather, a million times rather, have a serious conversation with a seeker who has noticed the same problem, is awake to the same problem, and is working on finding ways through these problems in this crisis, than I would with someone at my church who ticks all the doctrinal boxes, but is oblivious and wishes to remain untroubled by the meaning crisis around them. And so that's the spirit I find here as a newbie, is a spirit of people who are awake. Dare I say it?
Steal back the word.
We're Vanderbilt.
That's probably an actual last name. I'm not done.
Yeah, oh, okay.
I mean, I'll jump for a second, why not? I think the spirit is fellowship. You can sort of read it either way. It's the fellowship that is galvanized or catalyzed by a spirit, but it's the spirit that is being catalyzed is friendship. And I'm not just trying to be cute about that, but I believe, Neil, I remember meeting you for the first time in southern Massachusetts with Paul in that estuary. And remember you said, I reached out to Chad because I just kind of knew that Chad was supposed to be my friend. Like it was that. And it's sort of in its initial simplicity, and then of course all the complexity that follows from that. But it's friendship. It's, and John, you were speaking earlier about the struggles of your students and even your son, and the friendship is exactly what we're longing for: friendship, relationship, these kinds of things. And for whatever reason, many of us feel sort of thrown, and who do we turn to? What do we turn to? Well, a friend is precisely the kind of thing that regrounds you. And when you were talking about, Elizabeth, that you're not even just you're only you because you have an other who can confirm you as a you. And so to me, the Spirit is friendship, but fellowship is what we're after here.
And I think that shift from what Jonathan is describing there and how he lays it out is fundamental to deal with, let's see, the skepticism, because I think part of what happens in this movement towards materiality, and it's funny because our mastery of technology in the domain of materiality is both empirical and rational, because matter itself is in some ways an abstraction. And even because technology is so forceful and effective, we seldom see the necessary substantial abstractions within the worldview that is there. And so the pointing to a muse, is the muse a thing? And I don't know if you can say that to someone who, like all of us, has been so formed by this substance imaginary to not think about the muse as a thing rather than a power or an energy.
Genius was something endowed inside of you rather than something given to you or graced to you for, sort of like the way you're talking about with charisma in the ancient world. It seems to me, from your description of it, obviously this idea of having a story that can spread farther than interpersonal stuff, Jesus seems like a really good example of that, and the story of Jesus and all that. But getting closer to modernity, when you think about a non-institutional figure who causes people to have an internal transformation, because I think that's a really important part. When I talk about politics, I started calling Barack Obama a charismatic figure, because in my reading of Weber, part of being a charismatic figure is that followers project onto the figure what they want to see.
I think this element of institutions and charisma is super important, because I don't, it's ironic, because going back to what Ezra Klein said about Obama was sort of Trump has charisma in the way that Worthen is using it in a way that Obama didn't. Obama was the culmination of a vision. Okay. And I think his power was from, in 2008 when he first ran, his power was from the culmination of that vision. And Trump, there certainly is a culminative element of Trump, but he is changing in a way that Obama never did. And this gets back to this sort of, when Ezra Klein talks about sort of, there was no beyond Obama 2008, which made his presidency so frustrating, especially for many true believers. And I think what wokeism was one of the beyonds that it's sort of like in these, if you're watching a Roadrunner cartoon, now I'm really dating myself, with Wile E. Coyote. And, the coyote would always run off a cliff and they keep running in the air. That was sort of wokeism. They're sort of running in the air, and then now they're in their drop.
In them. And so you can have really diverse people with different views all getting what they want out of the figure. But in the sort of pre-modern period, when I was listening to you talk, one of the people who comes to mind is Joan of Arc, right? She was a non-institutional kind of figure who had this narrative that caused a whole movement, nation to rise up. Are there other figures that you would? I know you started 400 years ago, and I shouldn't criticize you for only going back 400 years, but are there other sort of figures that you can think of that sort of?
Now again, she's an academic, so she sticks pretty much to her discipline, and her discipline is American church history. So she can't go back that far.
First of all, am I right about Jesus and Joan of Arc? But like, are there other figures that you would put in that? Jan Hus, maybe, or whoever? I mean, Martin Luther, to a certain extent, he's a little different.
Yeah, well, all these figures are prophetic figures, and there's an impulse there that carries over in I think a pretty definite way into the colonial period of American history, which I label kind of the era of the prophets.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's true that there's always this sort of dialectic and tension between charismatic figures and institutions, although often they find a way to meld their charismatic authority with institutional authority. There's certainly not a hard line between the two, but I think generally speaking, in the medieval Catholic Church prior to the Reformation, without like romanticizing the control, the monopoly on charisma that the Catholic Church had, I think in general in Christendom it was a pretty stable, workable economy of supernatural power, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly, you have these outstanding cases like Joan of Arc or Jan Hus that cause major problems for the hierarchy and need to be burned at the stake. Right. But generally, the Catholic Church for hundreds of years is pretty good at channeling the desire that shows up in some religious geniuses, really, to use your term, to access, to do a sort of.
I think this is just a terrific observation. And what's interesting is why and how the Catholic Church lost that capacity. Because when I read 19th century Catholic history in Europe, I mean, it goes even earlier, of course, into the 18th century and the end of the 18th century with the French Revolution. They lose that capacity to sort of hold it together.
Sort of end run around the hierarchy and access divine authority in a more direct way. They channel that into, hey, found a new monastic order, or, let's take this lady prophetess and, wall her up and give her a father confessor, can sort of keep her on the straight and narrow and make sure that her revelations don't deviate too far from orthodoxy. Like that works pretty well. And on top of that, and
I think part of the reason that the Catholic Church loses this capacity is once the printing press is there, you can't bottle up Martin Luther the way you could use walls. One of the things that's interesting in the history of the conquest of Rome in the 19th century is Roman walls couldn't keep out artillery. And the Pope Pius IX first brings in street lights and telegraph and railroads. And so technology undermines the means by which these eruptions could be domesticated by the institution for the welfare of, trying to keep things together.
A Catholic person, there are all these doors and windows through which you are permitted to contact the divine. To use Charles Taylor's term, there's like a porousness to experience that I think it helps to satisfy and direct the human urge for connection with a transcendent power. I do think that the American story and much of what makes the United States different and makes charismatic leaders particularly resonant in this culture really starts with the Reformation. Mm-hmm, and it starts with the destruction of the Catholic monopoly on charismatic power that comes to really reduce and make overly simple a complicated story, comes in the insight and the revolution introduced by Martin Luther, who was no populist, right? I mean, when German peasants took his critique of the church to imply that they could overthrow the social order, and they launched the Peasants' War in 1524, he writes a treatise called "Against the Thieving and Murderous Hordes of Peasants," saying you all drew worldly conclusions that I did not intend. And in many ways, he wanted to collaborate with existing institutions and reform them to better align with his understanding of the Bible and his idea of the change in relationship that happens between God and the saved Christian. But there is, in the kind of kernel of his theological revolution, justification by faith alone, in which God makes this capricious decision to change his view of the individual depraved worm with no regard to the good works done or not done by that depraved worm, and that everything hinges on your personal internal relationship, that is really only accessible to you with God. There is this kernel of powerful individualism and a mandate to reach out and claim a connection with the transcendent that is, I think, revolutionary and finds over the centuries its outworking and its kind of most extreme metastasized form in American culture, which becomes, relative to peer cultures across the West, a relatively free religious marketplace that encourages what you could call sort of spiritual entrepreneurship, both in religion.
And of course, Tocqueville picks that up. Tocqueville, after he has his sojourn in America, he becomes the prime minister of France under Napoleon III, and he's really wrestling with the question of the revolt in the Papal States and the creation of the Roman Republic, and wrangling with Pius IX and his when he's staying in Gaeta and then Naples. And one of the things when I read this history, which of course you're looking at the 1840s, the 1850s, the 1860s, you're right there in the United States. You're in a period of westward expansion. Of course, 49, you have the gold rush in California. You had the Mexican-American War. And then you've got the questions of slavery, and the slave question in America is sort of taking all the oxygen out of the room and focusing the whole country, which of course will culminate in the American Civil War from in the early 1860s. And when you read this European history, you just get the sense of what a different world Europe is religiously and politically. France is a superpower still in the middle of the 19th century in many ways. But France, of course, is anybody politically stable in the 19th century? England, more so than many. France is just going all over the place. Germany is coming together. Spain continues to be something of a basket case. And of course, Prussia is on the rise, and that's going to really, create Germany, which of course leads at the end of the long 19th century to the First World War. So you very much see America as a place where charisma can be in full effect. And again, I think of Ross Douthat's conversation, Ross Douthat's observation about Marianne Williamson, who in her presidential run, was that in 2016, when, why doesn't she found a church? There's a sense in America that with non-denominationalism being sort of the fastest Trinitarian church movement in America today, institutions may act as platforms, but certainly not containers.
And in politics. So I think the story, relative to peer cultures across the West, a relatively free religious marketplace that encourages what you could call sort of spiritual entrepreneurship, both in religion and in politics. So I think the story of charisma in America is in many ways a peculiarly Western post-Reformation story.
So I'm kind of curious. I'm a big believer in American exceptionalism. I have to say, rightly understood, right? It's going back to like the Werner Sombart, why is there no socialism in America thing, and the standard story that we.
Okay, now the conversation takes a very interesting turn into comparing Canada and America, and Colin really got at that during the live stream a bit. But I'm not going to play it because I only have so much time once the Anglicans get in here. And, it's so funny because I know when I talk about Nigerian Anglicans, a bunch of you are going to think, oh, Anglicans are quiet. There'll be nice organ music and there'll be vestments and there'll be candles and there will be vestments and there will be candles, but the Nigerians are not quiet. They're usually meeting in a smaller room over in another building, and they put up these big speakers for the 12 or 15 people that are in there usually, and they turn them up. So I have to get as much of this video done before they come as I can.
Right about the underlying cause, then charismatic populist politics can get you into an enormous amount of trouble.
I think that's right. I'm pondering your comment a few minutes ago that anti-intellectualism is inherent in populism, and I'm thinking about what to do with this potent dimension of kind of late 19th century populism, which is the focus on education and these kind of local this local commitment among these farmer communities to pretty systematic education of their members. It's kind of it grows in some sense out of the Lyceum movement, and this sense that information should be democratically available, and that farmers, if they simply have access to the latest thinking on economics and agriculture, they can solve so many of their own problems. But overall,
that's a very interesting counterpoint to my thesis, and I take it well. I mean, it's a good point. But
overall, I agree with your assessment, and I think there's a way. So, kind of pondering the longue durée of American history that I've been thinking about from the perspective of charismatic leaders, there's a way in which the power that Trump has and the role he plays, and also I think Americans' susceptibility to a whole host of figures I call sort of guru figures in our own time, and there are echoes between our moment now and these previous eras. But at the same time, it seems like in prior eras, charismatic leaders functioned in a more balanced ecosystem. Certainly, their potential followers existed in a more balanced ecosystem where they were deriving identity and they were getting information from a wider range of institutional sources, communities. They had more contexts in which to sort of decide whether they found the story offered to them by the charismatic leader compelling.
And that's so important because part of the irony, I remember the first time I had to think about the fact that we imagined Google and the internet was opening up a floodgate to information. And that's analogous to this epistemic shift that has happened that you can understand with Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke and Cogsci, that Google was not a floodgate. Google was a filter, because we can't handle a fire hose. We can't handle a flood. We need a filter. And generally speaking, I mean, the first Vancouver conversation between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris was Jordan Peterson continually tried to get Sam Harris to admit the information that we perceive in front of us is pre-filtered. we do that pre-consciously. In other words, the world that we see before us, this was Jordan Peterson's big point. The world that we see before us is a function of the values that we have already consumed and absorbed and used to create a filter. It's not an unfiltered world, that a buffet that we have to choose from. No, the filter is already in our head. Just like if you walk outside and you say, you can eat anything you'd like. Can I eat the iron fence? Can I eat the block wall? Can I eat the street? Can I eat the grass? Actually, what you can actually consume is a tiny little portion of the combinatorial explosiveness of all the matter that is before you. But you see the apple tree. And in that way, I think she's right in that this strange new environment that we're living in, that we think is an abundance of information, is actually a pre-filtered selection of information, and that's distorting the capacity of the people to manage the elements in the narrative that they're using to move forward. And that's a difference from what we've seen in American religious life prior to this.
I think there's a way in which now, we're in this time in which American confidence in institutions, right, across the board, right? I mean, from the federal government to mainstream media, higher ed, even the military has less trust from American citizens than it has in prior eras. There's this way in which the equilibrium is off. The institutions are so weak right now. They are less able to stand up with the appropriate checks and balances to the challenge of charismatic leaders, who are calling to kind of burn it all.
And I think part of the reason I'm so fascinated with this period, at least fascinated right now, this comes and goes, of course, fascinated with this period around the loss of the Papal States and the loss of Rome as the territorial dominion of the papacy, is in fact this question of the rise and fall of institutions.
Down. And meanwhile, Americans, while we think as we sit on our sofas, scrolling with our little glowing rectangles, we think we are these autonomous learners who can command any information we want with a little bit
doing
of
our own
searching.
research.
Do your own research, right? I mean, it's a lie, right? I mean, actually, the algorithms keep us in these little boxes, and we have less ability than ever before to, challenge whatever narrative we're being fed and asked to join in. So, I share your concerns, and I think part of what you're diagnosing is that this particular weakness of institutions, which to me, when people use the term secularization, usually we confine our meaning to the sphere of organized religion. But really, secularization is, to me, just a sort of shorthand for the decline of individual involvement in and trust in institutions in general. It does not describe a diminution of spiritual needs. That, as you say, those needs will find their satisfaction somewhere else if they don't find it in churches or temples.
So, I want to come back to that with the time we have remaining, because Weber also has this line about...
Well, and her point about the institutions, I think, is also really important, because churches and temples are particular institutions. And what has happened is that thinking about religion as functionality, which is sort of the sociological definition and the anthropological definitions that emerge with the social sciences, is that people are getting their functionalities met in politics, in sports. Part of what I think we see happening now is the functionality is getting met on just playing the internet with other tools. It's so... So my sister has launched, she's been playing with AI, and she's been playing with AI as video, as music, as just about every way you could play with AI. And she's constructed a fictional New England village, and it's extremely nostalgic. And now she started one of these, you can figure out how to do this. And I'm thinking about this because actually my sister and I started on YouTube, and then my sister went on YouTube because I said, oh, you should play around with YouTube, Ruth. You could do some things with this. Because she got chronic fatigue in her 30s. Well, it might have even been in her 20s. It was soon after she married. And so she hasn't sort of had regular jobs, but she's very artistic. She's extremely creative, and she's extremely smart. And she is the picture of when Jordan Peterson talks about people who are very high in openness have difficulty monetizing. That's been my sister. And so she started a YouTube channel about basically New England style primitive decor. And her channel's done quite well. But she gets antsy and bored with things, and so she goes on to new things. And like me, she likes playing with things and starting things, and so she started this completely AI channel that is full of just quiet music. And it's all AI music, and there'll be different scenes, and you can just get this thing going, and you can just leave it running. Skank's, I put this on Twitter. Skank's response to this was John Vervaeke with laser eyes. And I totally get it. I totally get it. But this is for some people, this is a religion of sorts. And what are we at now? Oh, now we're on the ocean. You get what I mean? And so part of where this goes, YouTube is the institution of sorts.
The disenchantment of the world, which is sort of, in a way, the secularization that you're talking about. But I want to drag you back to the Protestant Reformation for 2 seconds. I recently had a very friendly disagreement with another historian, Alan Gelzo, about ideas versus material forces. And it was a very awkward thing for me because I'm usually on team ideas, and he outflanked me. And we got into...
All right, I got to speed this up. Everyone's coming in.
Any glimmers of hope that we will be able to adjust like we did? Eventually we adjusted to the existence of radio. We adjusted to the existence of TV. But the pace of innovation with the social media stuff seems like it's going to be a while before we get meaningful institutional gatekeeping back.
Mastery of whatever the current most powerful means of disseminating your message, I think, is a necessary but not sufficient condition of being an effective charismatic leader. I can't think of a case I wrote about in which that is not present. Mm-hmm. And part of what is so powerful about a given movement, whether it's Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church, sending out missionaries and copywriting and printing up as many copies of the Book of Mormon as he can, and sending them far and wide to Britain, actually, right? I mean, mm-hmm. So there's like thousands of converts in Britain who upend their lives, move across the Atlantic to this tiny town on the banks of the Mississippi, Nauvoo, Illinois, never having met this prophet, right? Yeah. So this was one of these moments in my research that helped me see that the locus of the charisma is not in the guy, even mm-hmm. though he's awfully important as a major player in the story he's offering. But the charisma is in the story, and the story needs technology to travel. On the other hand, I found myself wanting in this book to push against what I think is a tendency we have to really see a deep, unbridgeable chasm between our era and everything that came before, and to kind of blame the internet for everything, and see all humans who lived before that as in some fundamental way different. I think really there's more continuity than difference, certainly when it comes to like the fundamental human hungers and drivers of these charismatic relationships. In terms of prognostication, I mean, I'm a complete curmudgeon and pessimist. I guess I'm encouraged that when I ban all technology from the moment one crosses the threshold of my classroom, students are actually more and more appreciative of the rationale and the fruits of this, and I'm intrigued by the hints of religious renewal that we're seeing, especially among Gen Z and disproportionately among young men, although not entirely. These statistics that are coming out of the usual religion poll operators like Pew and Gallup that suggest that, number one, the proportion of Americans who totally have disaffiliated with organized religion and won't even claim it as a label, that number finally seems to have plateaued, but is in fact dropping among younger Americans. And we're seeing these sort of weird surges of conversion to highly, in many cases, highly hierarchical, but in all cases, deeply supernatural and weird and quote unquote pre-modern expressions of Christianity, into Eastern Orthodoxy, Catholicism. In the UK, more kind of charismatically inclined Anglican churches are seeing uptick in numbers, especially among young people. And I'm afraid to even have this thought, because I'm such a dour Augustinian, and I'm not an optimist. But I do detect a kind of exhaustion among younger Westerners with this mythology they've been fed since the 1960s, which is the key to happiness is to divest yourself of all obligations and burdens to any institution or tradition, and to shed as many duties as you can, and to find the quiet flame that is your authentic self, right? This sacred term, authenticity, and then to cultivate that and quote unquote find your passion. And do that, go it alone. You can find your own meaning, make your own meaning. And in fact, this story, which tells us we can be our own messiahs, it has, I think, led to a great deal of false hopes and misery. And we're social creatures, right? I mean, I'm a big fan of modern liberalism. I'm not suggesting we go back to some sort of Catholic integralists' fantasy of the Middle Ages, but at the same time, I think we're due for a course correction that re-engages with deep ties to institution and tradition, not in this sort of casual pick and choose from the buffet of political and spiritual options way that is the norm for so many Americans, but in a way that actually involves real sacrifice and submission. And I think it's really interesting that more and more younger Westerners are curious about that way of dealing with the human condition. And maybe that suggests we're turning a bit of a corner.
Yeah, I share with you, because I completely agree with you about institutions. We talk about that a lot on here. I'm a big Yuval Levin fan about the role of institutions, and giving yourself over to an institution, a good institution, right? Because there are bad institutions. If you join the mafia, it'll make you a worse person. But bending yourself to an institution is a non-zero sum benefit. You make the institution better and you make yourself better. You need the right to exit, right? For the most part. It's a little more complicated for the military, but even there you have the right to exit. You just have a higher penalty for doing it. And so I'm totally with you on that. What I worry about is, and And I just don't know the data.
Worry. We are so captured by our anxieties.
I don't know enough about the ground truths of some of the religious awakening shoots that we're seeing around, which I would welcome if they're authentic and healthy. I think it would be good for the country and good for the people involved. What I don't know is how much of it is, we talked a bunch here about the sort of religionization of politics, but there's also the politicization of religion. And you get a lot, there's a lot of stuff out there about, churches, specific denominations, confusing the role of I'm going to forget his name. He used to be the head of the Baptist seminary.
Al Mohler?
Yeah, no. He's now the editor of World Magazine, I think. I apologize. He's a friend, and I'm brain fried. But he tells the story about how he's had parishioners come up to him, or pastors have told him the story about how he'll say things like, turn the other cheek, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, all these sorts of things. And people will come up to him afterwards and say, you really shouldn't be bringing that woke stuff into church. And he's like, I was literally quoting Jesus. And that stuff I find very, very disturbing. Julian Benda's Treason of the Intellectuals, which is kind of a wild ride and all that. But, one of the things I took from that was you can always identify essentially a political religion. You can a politicized religion or religionized politics when you hear people in the early 20th century saying things like, Jesus was the first X, first socialist, first eugenicist, first nationalist, all these sorts of things. And it's this attempt to yoke this transcendent concept to a political agenda that I think is one of the truly wonderful things about Christianity in my book, is that, it's against immanentizing the eschaton, in the sense that it reserves paradise for the hereafter, not the here and now. And those social gospelers from the early 20th century, they wanted to have a kingdom of heaven on earth. And that always strikes me as, or I shouldn't say always, often strikes me as an attempt to borrow on the cheap the authority of religion for a political agenda. And when you do that, it becomes very difficult to argue on strict public policy terms against it, because lurking in the background is this sort of religious homunculus, which is the real impulse. And in this populist moment, there's just a lot of evidence that there's a lot of politicized religion out there. And I hope that the Gen Zers who are returning to religion are returning to it for the religion and not for a doubling down of the politics.
It's really interesting what he just says there. It's important. It's just, what does that mean? What are you thinking? What are you thinking? And I just hear this, talk about our anxieties. I just hear this nervousness about the strong gods and what he was saying.
Oh, I'm completely with you. I'm really worried about it. I do think that there's a large swath of American Christians for whom a story that is not Christianity has kind of devoured or infected the Christian story. And so much depends on individual mentorship, I think, for these young men who are, I think, pulled in the direction of a sort of really hate-filled, revenge-minded, understanding of becoming Christian as a reclamation of worldly power.
Yeah.
And what I would say is actually the Christianity of Jesus. And we are at a sort of crossroads point where I don't think it's clear which way it's going to tip. I do think that the genius of Christianity is that it's a religion built on a set of interlocking paradoxes, and one of those paradoxes is the already not yet paradox. So while Jesus said that his kingdom is not of this world, it's also true that his resurrection is the sort of first fruits of the kingdom, and Christians are supposed to live in this way that recognizes that in some way that the kingdom is already breaking through. And I get frustrated with these survey instruments that pollsters create that try to capture quote unquote Christian nationalists, because so often the questions on them are things like, do you believe in prophecy? Do you believe in God's providence? Do you believe that a person's religious beliefs should inform their political decisions? Any mainstream, remotely Orthodox Christian would tick all of those boxes, yes, and that can end up conveying this sense that.
And by that point, or Mark D. Parker is a Christian nationalist, the one of the two pastors of the House of Wu.
That there's like this monolithic, army, that is the language you sometimes see in the media, of millions of Christian nationalists. And my instinct has always been, to really assert the complexity and infighting and internal diversity of this world. But that's not to minimize precisely the problem that you're describing.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, one of the problems with the survey research is evangelical has become a term for a certain kind of white conservative. And then you ask these self-described evangelicals, when was the last time you went to church? And it was a long time ago. So it's something else is going on there. And there's a great poll that came out a while back asking people if they'd heard of Christian nationalism. And it turned out that like self-described sort of blue state liberals were very familiar with the term, and actual Christians were fairly unfamiliar with the term. And it gets at this. I mean, I'm not saying I think the Christian nationalism thing is a problem, but I think I agree with you entirely. It would be folly and unfair to describe anybody who believes that Jesus Christ is their personal savior, or believes in the Nicene Creed, or believes in Christianity, is therefore a Christian nationalist. And I think part of the problem is we have a lot of journalists who know nothing about religion, and they just think they're all these strange others. And they hear sincere Christians who may detest Donald Trump or vote Democrat or 1,000 other things, but they use language of Christianity as like, eek, a Christian nationalist. And that's going to create more Christian nationalists than anything else.
That's right. And the kind of complicated, moderate expression of this, the pastors who actually are trying to assert, their congregants' identity in Christ over any political identity, and are criticizing, both parties. They just don't make for the same kind of, juicy news headlines.
Yeah, exactly. The planes that land don't get a headline. All right. I could do this all day. This is fascinating.
All right. It was a great interview. I'm going to have to land the plane here, but thanks for watching. Leave a comment.
Well, I don't know about the meaning crisis, left, right, black, white, or other vices, which Jesus Christ is right, or if we're all saved. From my perspective, our propositions participate procedurally, running in circles. Remember in body, we're in the age of decay. Symbolically speaking, the reapers are reaping, them damn egregores are whispering sweetly. We're all NPCs in the belly of the beast. Red pill, blue pill, bread pill, Mars Hill, or DMT, or whatever you feel. Got one and number two, it's all the same damn thing. So clean your room, repent on Zoom, ontology for dummies, a bird's eye view. 'Cause if you really knew, could you really even say? Totally depraved, all totally saved, a total disposition from the bed we all made. Or is it the elect, or are we just insane? From John Vervaeke to Jonathan Pajot and Jordan Peterson to the Chris Pacou Show, Paul Vanderklays and Griswold Grimm and all the dice he shakes. This estuary ditty is a little bit cringy, ain't quite the U-shaped or the hero's journey. All the NPCs in the flood treading water to watch you save the day with a bunch of chitter-chatter. From the ortho bros to the Catholic Joes or atheistic Jobs, to Protestant folks, the Joe Schmoes and Jewish Jacobs, and everything in between. So love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, with all your mind and your fingers and toes, all your neighbors too, as if they were your own. So love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, and with all your mind and your fingers and toes, all your neighbors too, as if they were your own.